it's all about color. Today, I'm sharing an easy method for choosing colors for your stitching. I start with upholstery fabric in a deep raspberry tone, and then I choose some solid colors to coordinate. And then I go into my stash of pattern fabrics and I choose pieces to match. I talk about using stitch to blend and contrast colors. And in addition to color, I also talk about line and value and the role that they play in creating a pleasing collage. I also demonstrate in detail how I use the blanket stitch to fold under fabric at the edges and create a colorful and decorative border. So join me and create your own slow stitching piece full of beautiful color. I'm glad you're here. Let's get started. So my inspiration is this small piece of upholstery fabric. It's a medium weight and I really like these spots on it. So I've pulled out one of my bird templates, and that's from my set of 6 birds. And I'm placing it on my fabric. Any of the shapes from that set of 6 would work really well here with this fabric. And I'll put a link in the description if you want to have a look at that set. And it also comes as a PDF instant download. So I think that the size of these sort of silvery white marks that are on this fabric are really nice for the scale of this bird. So I'm going to trace this bird template onto the fabric. I'm going to use my friction erasable pens for that. And I have them in a few colors. I have a fine one, a 5-point, and I also have these 7-point ones. And I think for this fabric, it's slightly textured. I'm going to use one of the thicker ones, the 7-point. And I'm going to trace my template and then cut it out. And before I do that, I want to show the back of this piece of upholstery fabric. I've had a few comments from my last video, and folks were wondering about the paper that's on the back and what I do with that. So with these samples that I have, I can just tear the paper off. I just get in there, I find a spot, and I start to rip it. Now some of the paper does like to stick to the back, but if I keep at it and I just keep peeling, it comes all the way off. And there isn't any residue or glue or anything, except for on this very top piece. Now this is the part where all the pieces of fabric were connected together. And so the paper is thicker and there is a heavier glue that's underneath this paper. So when it comes to this strip that's on the top, the best thing to do is to just cut it off and discard it. But for the rest of the fabric, I really can just tear off this paper and then come back in the spots where the paper hasn't come and just work at it a bit. And once the paper's off, it really does have the same texture as the rest of the fabric. And so I can use it all the way to the edge, and I'm really only losing that one strip where everything was connected. So now I'm going to take my pen and I'm going to trace this template. And I'm going to do it right on the edge of the fabric. So I've chosen this bright blue color. It might be really hard to see here, but it's dark enough that I can see it. And so I'm just going to take a pair of fabric scissors and I'm going to trim around the edges. Now, if you were worried about the fabric fraying, depending on the thickness and the type of fabric, you could iron on some interfacing to the back, and that would help you be able to get a crisper cut. But with this fabric, I'm not too worried about it, and I don't mind some fraying. So you can see here that it's fairly crisp after cutting it out. It's a nice shape, and I expect that there's going to be some fraying once I start to stitch on it, but it's a fairly substantial fabric, and I'm not worried that there's going to be too many problems. So now I'm thinking about what colors I want to use with this bird in this burgundy, cranberry, raspberry color. So I've pulled out some really bright colors to see if I can get some inspiration for the type of colors that I want to use. So one of the ways to decide the colors that you want to use is to pull out some solid fabrics if you have them, or even solid colored paper if you have it, and then pull out some threads, coordinate, and see if you like any of the combinations that you can get. So I've pulled these 2 shades of orange and this light green, And I have both pearl cotton size 8 by DMC and the 6-stranded embroidery floss by DMC. And I think this color combination is really bright and cheerful. And I've chosen a color of floss in that dark raspberry color that matches really well with the bird. So I know I have a color there. And then I've even pulled out a lighter color of that raspberry to see how I feel about those colors up against the others. So now that I've got my color palette, I could go ahead and just use these fabrics and create a collage, or I can take these solid colored fabrics and I can take them into my stash of fabrics that are patterned, and I can try and pull colors that are similar. Now, one color that I haven't pulled out is the color of those spots that are on my bird. So I've pulled out a silvery white and more of an off-white that has more beige tones. I think either of these colors would work with this fabric that the bird is in, but I want to match it up against the other colors. And when I hold them up and look at them against the bird and the other fabrics, I feel like the silvery one is going to work better with all the other colors that I have going on. But if I had chosen some different shades, I think that this off-white color that leans more towards the browns would also work really well. When it comes to the colors that you're choosing that are your lightest or almost your white colors, you have some play there in just slightly shifting tones that are going to help everything coordinate together. So if I'd chosen some more browns, I think I would lean towards this beige one more. So now I'm ready to go to my fabric stash and pull out some fabrics that are roughly going to match these colors and see what I can come up with. So here's a basic collage that I've come up with. And I've placed everything onto a base of felt, and my piece is roughly 5 1/4 by 4.5 inches or 13 by 11 centimeters. So I've chosen this mottled orange fabric that roughly matches my darker orange, and I've chosen this very thin silk that roughly matches my lighter orange. And I folded this silk piece in half at the edges, and you can see in the middle that that white of the felt is showing through right in the middle. So that's a nice color difference, and if I want, I can even take a piece of that solid orange fabric and place it in the middle, and that'll add just a little bit more of color depth. Now the green that I chose that's on the bottom is actually slightly darker than this light green in my inspiration fabric. So I could take a piece of this lighter green and add that into my collage as well. And then I'll have a darker green and a lighter green. So when I take my bird that I've cut out in that deep raspberry color and I put it against these fabrics, I really like the way that that's working. Now these fabrics right now are just pinned in place, and I can move my bird around and decide exactly where I want it to be. And then I'm going to pull out those threads that I've chosen, first the pearl cottons, and see what I think about how they're matching. I think everything is working really well together. The color matches are not exact, and that's actually nice. That's going to add some interest when I stitch. So all the colors that I've chosen of my floss are going to work really well. So at this point, I'm not going to add any additional colors. I like that that green piece on the bottom has some white in it, and that's really playing off that light white or silver that's in the bird fabric as well. Now it's adding some continuity, and it's going to give me some inspiration for stitching as well. So now I'm just going to baste everything in place, and I use just regular sewing thread, any kind of waste thread, and I'm going to stitch some small stitches on the front and hop around on the back to secure everything down so I can take those pins out. So here's my collage all basted down. So I did pull a piece of that orange and I placed that in the middle of my orange piece, and then I pulled out a piece of that lighter green and I placed that across my orange, my darker orange. And now that everything's basted, it's held in place, nothing's going to move around, and I'm ready to begin stitching. One of the things I think from the very beginning that's working really well in this collage is that the shape of the bird is almost diagonally going from one corner to the other. And that's in contrast to the other fabrics that are going straight across or straight up and down. So from the very beginning, I have some really nice movement happening. So now I'm ready to stitch. So I've added one more piece to my collage, and that's a piece of the dark orange that I've placed under the bird. I'm thinking of it as a kind of branch. So at some point I'm going to stitch some little legs coming off that bird. And I think that's added a nice contrast of color there. And it's helped sort of anchor the bird in place. And I've also begun stitching, and you can see the light green piece at the top. I've chosen a darker color, a darker orange, and I've begun to stitch that piece down. I've also used the dark orange to stitch down that piece that's going to act as a branch under the bird. And you can also see on the right, I've taken some matching light orange and I've stitched down those orange pieces. So you can see with the stitching that I've done so far that you can match the color, and those stitches aren't going to show up in a contrasting way. They're just going to be showing up as texture. You can also stitch with a contrasting color like I did with the light green, and those stitches are going to show up more. So now that I have all my thread colors and I have my collage, I can really mix it up and stitch in matching colors or contrasting colors, and I can really start anywhere. I really can't go wrong when it comes to where I'm going to place my stitches. So for example, I'm pulling out this light green, and I'm going to stitch it right along the edge where the green fabric meets the orange. And I have a darker shade that I've pulled out, and that one is closer to matching that fabric that's on the bottom. So I have a lighter and a darker shade, and I can stitch all the way along that piece of fabric. And if I want, I can even extend those stitches out into the orange. So depending on where I stitch, this green is going to blend in and add texture, or it's going to contrast and add some more interest. And then when it comes to my lightest color, my silvery white, and my pink tones, it's going to be the same thing. It all depends on where I stitch. And I can keep in mind with the light colors and the dark colors that those are going to add different kind of contrasts as well. So now I can just relax and stitch knowing that everything's going to work out in the end. So I've added some stitching in the green right along the edge where that green meets the orange, and you can see that it's a really subtle effect that it's giving. I've also added some circles in the light green using the darker green. Those are showing up a little bit more because there's a light and dark contrast, but it's still fairly subtle. So I'm going to show you what I do along the edges. I'm taking the darker green here. I'm just coming up, doing straight stitches, and I'm not trying to make them perfect. I'm actually on purpose angling them in different directions, and I'm making them slightly different lengths. So that's going to add a nice grass-like texture right along that edge. And I already have that lighter color in the green there. And so I've got a dark and a light contrast that's going to happen here as well. So I just come up and I can work right on the front, taking a stitch, putting my needle down, and then coming up a short distance away. And then I can move over slightly to the left or right and create an angled stitch, and just keep moving along that line, creating these angled stitches. And so you can see here where I've brought that green up into the orange, it's showing up a bit more. It's adding a nice texture, and it's blending that spot together where those two colors are meeting. So I can think about that as I'm stitching on the rest of the piece, and I can vary what I'm doing. But I really like to just use these simple stitches and just change the length and angle of them a little bit to add that interest. So here I've taken that green all up along where these two fabrics are meeting, and that's added a really nice texture. And again, not making these uniform stitches at all. I could come in with the lighter green as well, and that would add even more interest. So I can just keep this in mind as I continue along. So now I'm going to bring out my darkest raspberry color, the one that matches the bird, and I'm going to stitch along the edges. And I'm going to use the blanket stitch. This is something that I like to use along the edges. And in this case, it's going to be really helpful to fold in the fabric that's hanging over the edges. You can see from the back here that the fabric comes off the edge of my felt. So what I can do is fold those edges under as I'm stitching, and that's going to give me some cleaner edges. I've shown this stitch before, but I'll briefly show again the method that I use. I come up from the back with my thread knotted, and then I'm going to fold my fabric under, and I'm going to come up right at the edge. So my thread's coming out at the edge, and then I'm going to go right underneath where I was, decide the size that I want my stitch to be, and go right underneath. And I'm holding that thread in my left hand as I pull up with the needle. And so the needle's coming inside that loop that's created. And it's going to create that blanket stitch. And then I just move over. I take another stitch the same way, bring my needle out near the top, right at the edge, and pull. And because I'm holding that thread to the left, I'm creating that loop. And I just keep going, moving over, probably about 1/4 of an inch. I'm not worried about the distance or it being perfect. Creating that loop and pulling that thread. It's always coming out right at the edge. And I'm using my left hand to fold that fabric down and hold it in place as I pull with my other hand on the thread to try to secure that fabric to the back. As I come up to the green, this is a quilting cotton, so it's thicker than the orange, which is a thin silk. So it's gonna react slightly differently. It might be harder to hold down with my fingers and fold. I just take my time and fold that under and work my way along. So there are my first few stitches, and I'm going to continue working my way along. So here you can see I've worked my way down the side, along the bottom, and up the other side. My stitches are placed fairly evenly. I'm going to get a piece of white paper and bring that in so you can see that even better. So here's my blanket stitching along the edges. You can see that color contrast is looking really nice. And one of the things you can do after you've created some blanket stitching is you can come back and do another round, and you can place stitches closer together, and you can create different areas where there's more and less stitching. And it's another way to create some marks on your piece, dark and light and contrasting color. So I think I'm going to come over here where there's this light green, and I'm going to add some stitching that's fairly close together, and that's going to create a different kind of mark. It's going to create a nice dark mark with this dark thread, so it's going to show up quite a bit more with those stitches really close together. So this is something that you can play with as you're stitching. Placing stitches closer together is going to create a mark that's going to show up more, and spreading them out is going to create texture and a more subtle mark. So there's lots of different ways that you can play with your stitching as you're making marks on your piece. So I'm going to finish off this blanket stitching, and then I'm going to decide if I want to add some thicker marks with the blanket stitching along the edges. So here I've done some more blanket stitching, and you can see in 3 spots I've come back and I've stitched really close together, and that's added a really bold mark. So I really like the way that that's looking. And that's something that you can do not just on the edge of your piece, you can do that on the body of your piece as well. If you place lots of stitches close together, you can get these really nice marks that stand out, and they add a lot of nice contrast in your piece. Another way to add more color is to add small snippets of fabric collage. So I've pulled out some fabrics. Now these are slightly different in terms of value than the colors I have going on here. And by that, I mean they're lighter. So I have these green tones. There's also some of the purple tones almost going into pink. And so adding some small snippets of these fabrics, they're going to add little blocks of color. So all I'm going to do is take these pieces of fabric that I know already match with the collage I have going on, and I'm going to cut some small pieces and place them all around. I'm also going to pull out another color of thread that matches these new pieces of fabric, so I can add that into my stitching as well. So here are the additional pieces that I've added to my collage. I've placed them all around, on the top and the bottom and on both sides. And I'm really liking the way that they're looking. I've got some almost white, so that's going to really match with those spots on the bird. And then I've got those light green tones and even some pinks. So now it's just a matter of integrating it into the collage by adding stitch. So here I've begun to add some stitching. I've added some more stitching along my border. So that's pulling all those colors together. And it's really adding a nice, joyful, colorful effect. And I'm going to continue adding stitch on these new small snippets of fabric. I can use matching and contrasting threads, knowing that everything's going to work together. So now I can just relax and stitch. So here is my final piece. You can see on the edges, I've used all of the colors, and I've varied the width of the blocks of color. So there's some skinnier and wider blocks. I've added in that silvery white along the edge as well. And all the additional stitching has really blended in those small pieces of fabric that I've added to this collage. So I hope this has given you some ideas and inspiration about adding color into your stitch work. You can take one or two of these ideas and try them in your next piece and see what you can come up with. Thank you so much for joining me. Until next time, happy stitching.